This video was digitized from the original DVD in 2023 by Simply Franciscan. It is part of the Zmuda-Moffat Collection of video recordings of lectures given by Franciscan professors and theologians on topics of Franciscan theology, charism, spirituality, and ministry. The lectures span more than 20 years. The Zmuda-Moffat Collection captures some of the seminal lectures shared with the Franciscan family in the rediscovery of the Franciscan intellectual tradition, a process which began in the 1970s and continues today. Sister Lisa Zmuda and Sister Kathleen Moffat videotaped these lectures from approximately 2001 through 2022 with permission from the speakers. Separately, they created and distributed study guides to accompany the recordings. Those study guides are available with the videos. Please look for a link in the YouTube post. For further information on the Zmuda-Moffat Collection, please visit our website at simplyfranciscan.org.
I want to say a couple of things about what this is, and from my perspective, what this is and what this isn't. As Seamus and I will tell you, there are a lot of very sophisticated academic conferences that do work on Scotus. This is not one of those. Hold the applause. All right. Scotus is the sort of person that academics can really get into because he has very specific insights in very specific texts. From my perspective, for your work, Scotus is not necessarily best used or even seen by you in his highly sophisticated academic role, though certainly I would never want to discourage anybody from reading a few difficult books on Scotus. However, where I do see his role for you and for your spiritual family is the particular period of history in which we find ourselves. I think you received a copy of the last chapter of the Scotus for Dunces book, where I really tried to lay out what I think is happening in our world and what I think the Franciscan tradition has to say for it. Quite simply, and I can't get any more blunt than this, I think an entire worldview is absolutely on the brink of self-destruction, unless it's already gone. And what we're seeing in the world are various attempts to reconstitute a way of seeing things that's coherent. And I think it's for this reason that educated lay people really find the insights of Scotus extremely attractive, because they're coherent insights. They actually fit together. And I think, as was said earlier by Joe, if we can find ways to translate these insights into ordinary, everyday insights that are meaningful to people, they really take hold of their hearts, and they take hold of their minds, and they want to know more. So from a sister of St. Joseph to the Franciscan family, one of the things I think that we religious have to contribute at this moment in the history of the world is a way in which spiritual, intellectual insights do form coherent wholes, so that people can find in these insights some way of making sense of a world that is largely out of control for many. And we are seeing, as we know, the resurgence of religious fundamentalism. This is not an alternative to, well, I suppose it is an alternative to religious fundamentalism, but it's an answer, it's an educated answer to religious fundamentalism that offers both intellectual food for thought and also spiritual food for people's nourishment. So, and here we go. Okay, so basically what's informed my work on Scotus over the last couple of years are questions like these. What are our resources? Those of us who are familiar with the feminist movement, especially in scripture studies, know the enormous work done by feminist scholars to retrieve already existing biblical passages that refer to God as mother. They are passages in the Bible. We don't make them up. There they are. We find them, we hold them up, we bring them forward, and we say, what does this say to us about the peoples who experienced the covenant? What does this say to us about their understanding of God? What can we learn from them, and what can their insights mean for us today? So all of our spiritual traditions, not just the Franciscans, I just happen to think yours is on point, as it were. We all have resources in our traditions that we've passed over. We haven't noticed them. They've been in the background, in the kind of a background foreground, a kind of gestalt. They've been background images. Well, I think it's time perhaps some of them should come into the foreground. And that's related to questions like, how can we be prophetic? How can we change not just injustice, but the structural assumptions that make injustice part of people's everyday life? It's really about changing the way people see reality in the broadest possible sense. And so to that extent, issues in formation, whether it's formation for membership or whether it's adult formation or ongoing formation issues, these issues are really pedagogical issues. They're issues about transformation of persons within lived contexts, so that they can come to see themselves and their world differently. So the question for me really comes down to, what can we do to put together, can you tell, I taught high school for a number of years, and I'm teaching college, anybody who's been in education knows there's a scope and sequence to the way people learn. And the question today for the tradition, I think, is what can we put in place structurally that can bring people both into the tradition and also through a transformative experience within the tradition that is transformative for their minds and their hearts, not just education, as Bonaventure said, not just education for the sake of my own career, but it's education for the sake of the transformation of my character. And so it comes down to, what is the vocation of a Franciscan today? It's just such a simple question. I'm sorry I have to be the one to ask it. So here's the guy I've been spending a lot of time with over the last 20 years or so, and I want you to get to know him if you don't know him well, because I really do think he has both a lot to say, and I think he wants a lot to say today. I've been to a number of gatherings, and this one is included in that, where hardly any prep goes into an immediate connection on the part of presenters who come together, and all of a sudden we realize we've all been thinking about the same thing for the last 6 months, and we've just not been talking with each other about it. I think he's behind it. I think he's tired of standing in the shadow of Thomas Aquinas, and I think he's interested in people getting to know his thought to the degree that his thought can be revolutionary today. He doesn't want us all to become experts in medieval philosophy or theology. I think that would be misguided. I think what he does want us to do is look at the primacy of Christ, look at the way in which creation, look at God's liberality, look at the divine desire, look at the order of creation, redemption, and salvation. All of those issues come together for him in one central insight. You all know it. I don't have to say it. It's God is love, and God so loved the world, he sent his son. That's it in a nutshell, and I think that is your tradition, and you live it every day, and he offers some remarkable insights, I think, for all of us Christians, not just those within the Franciscan family, but as I've said on other occasions when I've been asked to speak, if you won't speak for him, the rest of us can't, because we don't know the life he lived as a vowed Franciscan, and you do. You know the spirituality, you know the vision of the world, you're the ones who can give voice to his ideas today. And the rest of us who feel an affinity for that tradition can recognize what you say and then translate it into our own families. Okay, so he was born in Scotland, in Duns, that's why they call him Duns Scotus, right? John Duns the Scot, right? Not to be confused with Scotus Eriugena, who was from Ireland, who is often confused with Scotus because people see the word Scotus and they think there was only one. No, there were two. Born in 1265 or 1266, sometime between Christmas and Easter of that year. Died in 1308, died very young. One of the reasons why we have such difficulty with his texts, as many of you know, is quite simply his texts were left unfinished when he died, and so there are various manuscripts that we're dealing with to try to piece the thought together. I think the other thing was, he was a Franciscan, right? You people know the way you think. a lot of things were open-ended at the end. What else is new, right? I mean, this is just a tradition that leaves a lot of openings. Probably when he was 14 or so, he was brought to Oxford to be trained. He was, as the little orange paper you have, it's orange for the Sisters of St. Joseph of Orange. He was ordained in 1291. He taught in Oxford. He was moved to Paris. You can see the dates on there. Then he was sent to Cologne and died very suddenly. And there's just, we don't know the circumstances of his death. But I thought it would be appropriate to put down here historically misunderstood, and I think that is an understatement. Has always been misunderstood. In many ways, I think, in some of the difficulties people are having today with Scotus, is the tendency, and the default tendency seems to be to look to Aquinas as the paradigm against which every decent medieval thinker is measured. And I can just say to you, as someone who did some graduate work on Aquinas and then graduate work on Scotus, they are two completely different thinkers. And it is an error to try to read Aquinas through the eyes of Scotus, or Bonaventure for that matter, just as it's an error to try to read Scotus through the eyes of Aquinas. So try not to get into fights with any Dominican friends that you might have. Basically, when it comes down to textual evidence and things, the Dominicans have a lot more evidence on their side. Aquinas wrote 2 Summas. He died when he was 49. He had completed many of his major works. It's a finished product. And Father Alan Walter comments that one of the good news about Aquinas is it's a finished product. The bad news about Aquinas is it's a finished product. And you can quote the guy, and you can quote him textually and answer all these questions. The good news about Scotus is he's an unfinished product, but that's also the bad news about him. It's difficult for us to try to make compelling cases. I mean, there are a couple of issues. We're going to talk about them over the next few days. But on a lot of the scholarly disputes about Scotus have to do with texts that are quite simply unresolvable. He said this here, he said that there, and he died before he could pull it together. So makes for great articles in scholarly magazines. So when you've finished reading all of these and you want to turn to some other things, be my guest. Okay, so what do I think, right? This is all about me, really. What do I think are some of the striking aspects for Scotus? And I'll tell you a little story. Maybe Seamus can tell us a little bit later on this week how he first had an insight into Scotus. But as I said earlier, my doctoral advisor had a dream when I was doing my PhD work in Switzerland, and he said, I want you to think about Franciscan ethics. And so I did. I thought about them. And I started working on Scotus. Started working on Scotus. Some interesting things, a little piece here, a little piece there. Pretty good, okay. Finished my PhD, went back, was teaching in LA. Pretty interesting, little piece here, a little piece there. And I always had a sense there was something going on behind the little pieces. But it's like sometimes you'll read a scriptural passage and you'll say to yourself, there's something here and I just can't get my hands on it. Well, I carried that around for 3 to 4 years, and I would go for walks in the neighborhood and I would think to myself, the pieces just don't fit. And sometimes what happens in literature about Scotus is people will take one piece and just kind of run with it, and as if he wrote nothing else but this one piece. And so in a lot of ways, his position on freedom has been vastly misunderstood, and I'll talk about that later on this week. But one day when I was walking around the neighborhood, how fitting that I was taking a walk, right, in nature, right? I was walking around the neighborhood, and all of a sudden I thought to myself, wait a minute. What if the whole thing is an aesthetic? What if the whole insight, every piece of his metaphysics, his logical, well, maybe not the logical commentaries, but anyway, his metaphysics certainly, and a lot of his work on the will, what if the whole, and certainly his work in ethics, what if the whole vision is a vision inspired by an artist or an artistic temperament? All of a sudden, isolated pieces that I was never able to bring together fell into place. And it was within a couple of years after that that I finished The Harmony of Goodness. Because that for me was the insight, the coherent insight that brought everything Scotus said together. And from there on in, it was, oh my gosh, look at everything he's saying today. And so in some cases, when I talk to people about the difference between Scotus and Aquinas, I like to use the difference between an artist and a scientist. that I think Aquinas really has a scientific mind. And he comes at questions from the way a physicist would come at questions, or the way a natural scientist would come at questions. And so he's compelling for people who admire the scientific approach and who really do enjoy looking at things from a scientific point of view. I think Scotus is an artist, and I think he comes at things from an artistic perspective. So that people who are attracted to an aesthetic, a spirituality that's largely aesthetic in nature, Augustinian, in its basic thrust as distinct from Aristotelian, which would be more something that Aquinas would do, more the scientific approach, are going to find Aquinas very, very interesting. So what are we going to be looking at over the next couple of days? Well, one of the things we're going to be looking at, and Seamus is really going to develop this for us, is the positive vision of the human person that we see in Scotus's teaching on the incarnation, the divine desire from all eternity to create this world, and not just create this world, but to come and be among us. I tell this to my students and they just can't believe it. Why would God want to become human? I mean, if I were God, I wouldn't want to become human. I'd want to be God. But God wants to be with us, you know, and there's that beautiful line in Proverbs, I think it's Proverbs 8, you know, my delight. I was playing at his feet. It's a creation image, and then all of a sudden I was playing with him, and my delight is to be with the children of man. And I think, wow, what a God, right? So a Christocentric worldview, you know this, I don't have to tell you this. And a quote from Scotus, just so you can end the evening with a quote. The person is the summit of divine creativity. Now that doesn't mean, you know, get down off your high horse, as my father used to say, right? That doesn't mean, boy, are we swell. It just means that the greatest thing that God has made is a being capable of reasoning and loving. And we just happen to be copies or individual pieces. Did I break it? Oh no, here we go. Okay. Another striking aspect, optimistic vision of human nature, human desire and the good. I'll talk about this later on this week. The moral artist, which is something that I develop a lot in some of the things I do. The notion of moral living as an art rather than a science. And that doesn't mean we dismiss categories of good and evil. It simply means we look upon the formation of moral character in the way that we would look upon the training of an artisan. So any of you who know people who are potters or painters or musicians, these are people who have to work every single day at getting it right. And when they're finished, they are the fully formed artist. That, I think, is how Scotus sees moral living and moral development. And I think we could look upon it in our spiritual traditions. That's what formation, transformation, is all about. It should be the developing of the artist within, the spiritual artist within, who is him or herself a religious, avowed religious. And I'll talk more later on about the natural affection we have for justice. These just teasers, right? Just kind of tease you. Another striking aspect, I really like this one, and the older I get, the more I like it, and that's Scotus's enormous confidence in God's love. There is nothing but good stuff waiting. And that should change everything for us. Just the same as the ways the woman said, if, you know, why, the reason behind the incarnation makes all the difference. The fact that there is nothing but reward and abundant reward. What is that great line? God will never be outdone by generosity, right? Big time. So God's intention to create the world, redeem the world, sanctify the world, that was from the beginning. And my personal favorite aspect of Scotus thought is divine acceptance, divine liberality, graciousness. I was sent an email to our General Superior on another matter that I don't need to go into the other day, and I was telling Kathleen today, and she said, oh, you have to say that tonight. You know, the Sisters of St. Joseph, our basic charism is unity and reconciliation. It's because we're constantly making enemies with one another. We really have to learn how to make peace. And I sent an email to our General Superior during the week, and I said to her, you know, my work with Scotus has taught me that the greatest thing in reconciliation is the first step, and that is always a step of generosity and abundance. The first step in reconciliation is not asking for forgiveness. And I think the prodigal son is a perfect example of that. The son was not going to beg for forgiveness. He just wanted a job. And it was the father who ran out and overwhelmed him with gracious liberality and generosity that resulted in the Son's asking for forgiveness. Finally, the other striking aspect, of course, and this is the aesthetic piece, and that is the unique beauty of each individual. And this is the ever popular hexaitos, or the thisness, that Scotus talks about. Some of you may be familiar with it, and we'll talk about that later on this week. So that's my 4 favorite points about Scotus, just in case you were wondering why I like Scotus, right? And so what are some implications of this? And I think here it just gets better and better, because it's really all about you, isn't it? I mean, it's all about the fact that your tradition is a sacramental, well, our tradition is a sacramental tradition. And what does it mean to live in a sacramental tradition? Well, it simply means that everything is a sign of God's love. Everything. We don't have 7 sacraments. We've got 7 million sacraments, right? We just happen to isolate 7 of them so we can count them on a hand and a half, right? But part of this sacramental vision for me is the aesthetic model that just cuts right through Scotus, and I think is so uplifting and edifying. The value and dignity of everything that exists. That's the creation spirituality. That's the spirituality of affirmation of all that lives and all life and all that is. Not just all that lives, but all that is. And creation is a work of art. Rational creative love. A new way of seeing rationality. I mean, I think today we are too much tied into a kind of utilitarian, consequentialist, ends, means, technological way of looking at decision making. And I think it's wrong. I think people think it's wrong. I think we know it's wrong, but we don't have anything else to do in its stead. So we flounder, and we go with our gut sometimes, which in some ways is the worst possible thing we can do, because that going with our gut, I think, it's a cheap way out, and it's a bad default. What we have to do is re-describe and reinvent and probe a little bit more carefully. What does it mean to say that love is rational? We think of Augustine's insight about ordered loving, that's the goal of human life, is to love rightly. And you don't love rightly just by going with what you feel. You love rightly because there's a rationality to love. And this is a piece that is still undeveloped, I think, in terms of the impact of Scotus. And so there's a few points we can talk about later on this week. Integrity and transparency, and we'll definitely talk about this more as we talk about the formation processes and what does it mean to help develop in all of our members and all the people we work with persons of both integrity and transparency. Transparency both in terms of letting the inner light that they have shine forth, but also transparency in the way in which we are all called to be sacraments. And if we are transparent to God's work in the world, then it brings God greater glory. What does that bring glory to? What does it bring? What were they saying before? Serve the Lord with joy, right? With joy, right? And again, I just can't not mention God's generosity. Have I talked to you tonight about God's generosity? No. Okay. Have I told you it's going to be more than anybody ever thought? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Another big implication, of course, is beauty. And again, what you're going to find with me is I tend now to think more circularly than I do linearly. And so I keep sweeping back in, and we keep hitting it again. But I think that's a key to understanding a medieval thinker, because the pre-modern thinkers, and in many ways the third world people, think in circular models, not in linear models. And in some ways our first world Western or modern, postmodern first world way of seeing things is too linear, and everything has a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? And keep waiting for the end. So there they are, right? But notice this: multiple perspectives and modes of understanding. Educational pedagogy is now talking about all the different ways of coming at something. That's different learners, kinetic learners, and auditory learners, visual learners, right? And so when beauty becomes the center, well, of course you have to have multiple perspectives, because beauty is such that it cannot be grasped by only one explanation. So once again, more is coming, right? Okay. So just to kind of recap and to touch into some of the things that Ed said earlier, and this is my second to last slide, so we're nearly there. From my perspective, what are some of his, what are obvious to me Franciscan assumptions, right? I may be wrong here. That the intellectual journey is a spiritual journey, and Ed mentioned Bonaventure. I thought it was very interesting. What did you call it? The soul's journey to God? Yeah, I call it the mind's road to God, which is another translation of the title. Isn't that interesting? how the overly intellectualized title, The Mind's Road to God, has perhaps turned people off to something that is clearly in that text, and I'm sure most of you have had a chance to either study it or meditate on it, that it's about the whole human person who is a spiritual, intellectual being moving toward God. For Scotus, to be human is to be imago Christi. Now for many, like for Aquinas, to be human is to be imago Dei, the image of God. But for Scotus, it really is the image of Christ. We are created in the image of Christ. And everything, every perfection that can be attributed to Christ can be at least provisionally attributed to us. I think it's very Franciscan to talk about the rational order as an order of love. I don't know how well you live that out, probably as well as the Sisters of St. Joseph live out reconciliation, but it's good that we always have things to work on. I think, again, this is another piece of your tradition, that the whole is grounded in a transcendent order that's rational and loving. That at the heart of it all, and we'll look at this perhaps a bit tomorrow morning, at the heart of it all there is a being who is love, pure love. And that's the grounding for everything that's going on. And that's what makes it so interesting. And the whole is beautiful, right? And have I told you that at the end it's going to be even better? Right? And the human person is the summit of creation. So these are all assumptions, I think, that I found in Scotus that I have no difficulty attributing to the Franciscan tradition. So you can tell me if I'm wrong. So something to think about then. This is sort of my last slide. Sort of food for thought as you go to the reception, and then maybe tonight you think about this. What attracts me in this first pass at Scotus? What made me stop and think? What caught me off guard? And what are my next questions? Because we're all going to come back tomorrow. We're going to have a chance to ask some next questions. So I think I have a final slide with nothing on it, which I think is great. Isn't that great? So there it is. So it's open, right? See? We have an open-ended future. So thank you.